everybody, it's Kerrie here at the North East Autism Society, and we've got the lovely Georgina Watts with us today, and she's going to be talking to us about sensory differences. Hi George.
Hiya. So I'm George Watts, I'm autistic and ADHD. I was diagnosed as an adult. I'm also a mum to an autistic and ADHD 6-year-old and this troublemaker. So yeah, sensory differences. I didn't actually know I had any sensory differences until I realised I was autistic. And I remember a friend of mine suggesting, oh, well, why don't you try wearing ear defenders in this situation and see if that helps? And it never would have occurred to me that noise bothered me. Mm-hmm. But it made such a difference. So I think before I understood that I was autistic, I would just have meltdowns. I would just be really distressed, but not understand that sensory things were causing that. Mm-hmm. So I remember I'd sort of be like in a supermarket with my mum and I'd go, oh, it's too hot for me in here. And her response would be, oh, it's not that bad.
Mm-hmm. But for you, it really was. And
so you believe that, you believe what you're told. And how do you know whether your sensory experiences are typical?
Exactly.
Do any of us know that? And so it's not until I sort of started talking to other autistic people going, oh, this is something I really struggle with, that I recognize that in myself. Now I'm aware that although I really like a hot bath, being too hot is a massive trigger for me. And so I can work around that and go, okay, well, even though I like a hot bath, I need some literal sort of cooling off time after a bath because I'm a horrible person after having a hot bath. And my tolerance, my window of tolerance in that time is really, really low. So I need to sort of schedule that in ways that doesn't sort of then have other sort of consequences.
Yeah.
So I think being aware of my sensory differences has really helped. And for my daughter, I think it's been harder in a way because her sensory differences are slightly different from mine. So she's much more of a sensory seeker. So there was obviously quite a conflict where she'd be sort of making lots of noise and wanting sort of to go to places like soft play centres, which is very much my idea of torture. Yeah. So she'd want all the sort of noisy, loud, sort of bright coloured things, and that physically hurts me. So finding a balance between our needs is quite difficult sometimes. I mean, she does understand now, like, I won't go to like a playground with her when it's really busy because that is just too much for me. And so that's just how we have to work. We go to playgrounds when they're quieter. But she needs so much sort of sensory input. And there's a lot of things where it can be difficult to know when something is caused by a sensory need and when it's not. So I remember there was a time with my daughter when she kept having panic attacks if her pajamas rolled up her leg. And I thought this was a sensory thing. I thought she couldn't cope with like the pressure of like the cuffs of the pajamas like rolling up her leg. Yeah. And it wasn't until sort of one time she was having another panic attack about this, and it occurred to me to ask, well, why? What do you think will happen if they got your leg? And she went, it will cut off my circulation. Oh. And I told her 2 years earlier when she was like 3, don't let those roll up. It will cut off your circulation. I hadn't explained what circulation was. It was just something I said. Yeah. And she thought circulation was like a body part that was going to fall off if her trousers rolled up her leg. And so she'd been panicking for 2 years every time her trousers rolled up a bit because it was a literal interpretation of language thing.
Of course, rather than...
But I had assumed it was sensory.
And to be honest, I would think it was that as well.
So I think it's always useful to kind of ask yourself, well, why is this happening? What, rather than just going, oh, well, that's just a sensory thing. So it's a bit like with anything to do with autism. People go, oh, well, they're just banging their head against the wall because they're autistic, and then it doesn't occur to people that maybe they're depressed or So I think we always have to ask questions to try to understand why things are happening. I think that's always useful. But yeah, I think for us, especially for her, it's been about finding enough ways to kind of soak up some of that energy, some of the sort of sensory sort of stimulation that she needs. It's about providing opportunities for that, because if I don't provide them, she will find them in ways that aren't necessarily safe. So she will climb up everything and jump off everything and, find that stimulation. And that's been a big problem at school as well. Is your hand sore? Oh dear. So we have, a ridiculous number of STEM toys and things for her to do, and trying to, physically get her out to have enough exercise.
Yeah.
Which just kind of takes the edge off. And again, the knock-on effect of, if she's not allowed to STEM, if she's not sort of, if she has to hold it together. So I noticed, like at school, where she has, she's kind of forced to sort of suppress that a lot. It builds up, and at the end of the school day, when I collect her, it all comes out. So I remember sort of last year when she was like reception age, her coming out of school and doing 36 forwards rolls on the grass outside, because it built up and she needed that relief.
Yeah, and that's so common, isn't it? I think what you've just talked about, some parents call it the Coca-Cola effect, the after-school meltdown, all these phrases. It's very real, isn't it, for families, this effect?
But I think it shows how much they're being forced to hold it together in school, when really we should have OTM, we should have people sort of, providing opportunities for them to move in school to get that stimulation that they need.
Georgie, you mentioned something I'm quite keen to get across, that sensory differences can be painful. It's not just that it's a bit of an inconvenience or a bit of an irritant. It can be a painful experience, can't it? Have you got experience?
Yeah, so I think sensory distress, there have been studies using like MRIs, which show that we experience sort of things like loud noises in the same way that other people experience physical pain. And I think that's the best way I can get it across to people. So like having to stand right by a school bell that's going to go off, it's the same experience for me. It's probably slightly more distressing than if someone came and slapped me around the face. It would be easier for me to cope with the physical shock and distress of someone suddenly slapping me than that sudden noise.
Yeah.
But I think expressing it in terms of pain, it helps me to convey that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously, this is really insightful because you use verbal language and can tell us about these things. Do you have any thoughts on sensory overload? Is this something that you experience, just where the world just becomes too much and you've got to get out?
Yeah, I think for me, it's I can definitely tell times when I'm more likely to have a meltdown. So it's usually a sort of very cumulative thing. So there'll be a lot of sort of stressful things happening in my life. And sometimes it can be a really tiny thing that sort of ends up being the straw that broke the camel's back. So sensory things can be a big part of that. But I think the thing is, when we talk about autism, we talk about all these different factors. We talk about sort of sensory things, we talk about executive functioning, we talk about, all the social communication stuff, and we talk about these things in isolation. But I think people often forget that all of these things are happening for us all at once. So I could have, I don't know, a difficult interaction with my neighbour, and then have to cope with doing the school run. And then it's a bright sunny day and I forgot my sunglasses because my executive functioning's rubbish, so I haven't got my sunglasses when I need them. And so all of these things form, it all forms a perfect storm. And then it only takes a tiny little thing to tip me over the edge. So I think this is often the case for our kids. There's often so many different things going on, and a lot of those are outside of our control. We can't control how sunny it is out there. We can't necessarily control the temperature or the demands being put on them at school. So I think a lot of the time it's about trying to reduce overall stress levels, overall anxiety. If we can just lighten the load on some aspects of their life, to sort of, just widen that window of tolerance for other things.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. That's brilliant.